Hi guys, welcome back to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host, as always, Steve Hall, and today I'm talking to my man, Scott Stevenson. We dig into all things training for those who find it hard to grow muscle. And one of those areas that we dive into is the style of training that Jordan Peters does, so low volume, high intensity, versus someone like Nick Walker, who appears to leave some reps in reserve, maybe trains with some higher volumes, and kind of why do they both get great results? They're two of the most muscular men on the entire planet. Why do their training approaches look different? What could be down to that reason? And we dig into every avenue you can imagine, everything from mind muscle connection to fatigue, stimulus, and all the way into internal versus external focus within training, getting funky with it with your training, using unconventional means and methods to grow new muscle tissue, and also the role of novelty and how does that lead to more muscle growth if it does at all. Lots of great discussion, as ever, with Scott diving deep into the science of these sort of mechanisms, but with some great practical take-homes, especially for those of you who don't grow muscle like a weed. And therefore, you might be able to find some great nuggets of information, everything from nutritional approaches that you might want to try if you haven't before, and also, of course, training. We'll also touch on some of the Olympia results from the classic division, Terence Ruffin. Scott give us some of the insider scoop in terms of the German scene and what went on with Mike Summerfield, and lots of just fun stuff as ever with Scott talking about pain dynamics and different experiences too. So guys, if you do enjoy this, make sure to subscribe to the podcast, whether that be on Spotify, Apple for your podcast, or if you're on YouTube, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Every subscription is great support so we can keep bringing on people like Scott himself and you don't miss out on such episodes. Give us a review, give us a thumbs up. Any support is appreciated. And of course, take a screenshot, share this on social media, tag myself and Scott. And as a reminder, here at Revive Stronger, what I do for most of my day is coaching individuals, whether that be to a bodybuilding stage, just gain muscle, get fitter, get stronger, lose body fat, maybe for a photo shoot, or just get into the best shape of their life. Most people I coach are actually coaches, or they're people who absolutely love this and maybe are considering stepping on stage at some point and want to help with that journey to take their physique to the next level to get more results from their efforts. Something that makes our coaching different, of course, every coach should provide you bespoke nutrition, individualized training, all that good stuff is, of course, included. We really communicate closely with our clients. We give them plenty of time, and our check-in process is such where you get to give us a video. So you get to talk through your week, what went well, what didn't, ask us questions, and in the same regard, we get back to you with a video. So we can really go into depth discussing things. And so you really have a collaborative relationship with your coach. So if you are interested in such a thing, definitely check out our coaching. It's always linked in the description. But without further ado, let's get into the show. So Scott, you've spoken before about Jordan Peters and how he didn't necessarily respond extremely well to using kind of reps in reserve, essentially, leaving some in the tank. Jordan is known for taking things to the house regularly. Whereas there's someone that comes to mind, high level, Nick Walker, seems like he's using a more reps in reserve approach and seems to be doing really well with it. I'd love to know what your thoughts are when there are people succeeding kind of well with one approach, leaving reps in the tank, versus someone else who seems it just doesn't work for them at all.
Yeah, this question, all the questions you sent me are awesome. Like literally, I kept on like wanting to spend my free moments going back to think about them. So this one I thought about, I almost thought about doing a PowerPoint. Maybe sometime we could do one because I've been doing that more often. It just seems to be helpful. But so in order to kind of set the framework for answering this question, we got to understand why does hypertrophy even occur? Like our perspective as bodybuilders, you go and you lift weights and then hypertrophy is what's supposed to happen, right? But there are various adaptations that muscle cells can have to a given stimulus. Endurance training doesn't typically produce hypertrophy. Although you take someone who's completely untrained and put them on a jogging program, you can get some lean body mass from that. But there's enzymatic adaptation. So there are people who don't respond. There are non-responders in terms of hypertrophy, as well as strength, and maybe even both. That would really suck. But there are people who just don't respond to resistance exercise training stimulus in the way that most people do. So we have this normal distribution. And then there are those like Nick, and Jordan and Nick are two people, and this is why it's a really cool comparison, who are at the upper echelon of the human muscularity potential. They're two of the biggest humans who ever walked the face of the planet. They're both absolute bodybuilding freaks. I would say, and this you could justify this in various ways, that Nick's genetics might be better than Jordan's. And if we use that as a premise, they're both but Jordan's not an IFBB pro, and that's, because he wants to just train and be a bodybuilder rather than get on stage per se. And that's not a knock on Nick in any way, but there is the propensity to respond to a resistive overload, so weight training, that results in hypertrophy that varies. So some people can go and you've probably known these people, you've probably cursed their names. They just go in the gym and they just lift, and they don't really train that hard, and they just grow like weeds. And maybe a lot of the personal trainers out there have had clients like this. I've seen this. I've had these clients back in my personal training days. They just don't grow muscle very well, right? So for a given stimulus, a given number of sets, a given set or given number of sets taken to failure or taken short of failure, the relative impact that set will have on hypertrophy as an adaptation is something that's genetic. It's probably epigenetic. It may change over time, but that's going to vary amongst individuals, right? So that's one half of the coin. The other side of the process is the insult in terms of muscle soreness, of muscle damage, the results in soreness. Another way to look at it is we have muscle protein synthesis that's brought on and muscle protein breakdown that's brought on, right? And that has to be balanced out. And I hearken back to a conversation with Brandon Curry on my podcast with Scott McNally, Muscle Minds. And Brandon was talking about what goes on in the Middle East when he was training. There were guys who would pay big bucks to come there and train with him or his former trainer there before he got with Justin Harris. And he said these guys were really good bodybuilders, and they basically packaged everyone into the training regime that Brandon could handle and Big Ramy could handle and some of the other big names who were there. And a lot of those guys who came in, although they were really good bodybuilders, they didn't make progress. They couldn't handle that amount of volume. They couldn't train that hard with that number of sets and recover. So ability to recover from a stimulus also plays a huge role. So if you've got someone, let's say Nick or just in general, who is just really gifted or more gifted than someone else in terms of to what extent a set taken, let's say 2 or 3 reps shy of failure, works to turn on hypertrophy, that's awesome. In Jordan's case, apparently, and this is what I have noticed, this is what is probably the case for many people, is that stopping 2 or 3 reps shy of failure after you've been training for so long and gotten so advanced is no longer a stimulus. It's no longer novel. Maybe we're talking about novelty. It's the exertion level isn't high enough. Maybe the time under tension when you've got maximal recruitment of all the motor units that you can possibly recruit isn't enough in that set. Or maybe you need to do more sets. And eventually at some point in time, if you've done enough of those stimulating sets, which for you need to be harder than beyond 2 reps in reserve or 3 reps in reserve, they need to be right up to failure or to 0 reps in reserve. Then eventually you get to the point where, okay, now I can't recover from doing more of these stimulating sets. So because of my genetics for muscle injury, and there are numerous single nucleotide polymorphisms, genes like actinin 3 is a gene in the Z line. It's a costameric protein in the sarcomere, so it's a structural protein. There's isoforms of interleukin 6 and tumor necrosis factor that are involved with inflammation. So the inflammation that you have, actually IGF-2 has a variant too that is predictive of the proclivity of the tendency for someone to have muscle injury. So throughout the course of the whole cycle of recovery, where there's an injury, brought on by the mechanical stress, stretch-mediated calcium channels, all the things, and the inflammation, et cetera, et cetera. If you're someone who just can't recover from 10 sets, then literally you become limited to doing those 6 or 8 sets that are stimulating for you, because you have to take them all the way to failure to get a stimulus that would evoke a greater hypertrophy in the muscle you're training. And you go beyond that, you simply can't recover, right? Because you get too much injury or you get too much protein degradation. And it's really interesting. It made me think, and I all these questions are really, they fit together really kind of well. The novelty idea, there's a really interesting phenomenon is the repeated bout effect, or their protective effect. So you go in, and this has been demonstrated in umpteen studies. You do a particular injurious exercise, about typically eccentric exercise. So just like lowering a 1 rep max for 8 sets of 8 reps or something like that. You can actually do that. You produce massive soreness, right? And then if you go and do that same bout again, you don't produce as much injury and soreness. And there's various things that go into that. The central nervous system probably learns a little bit, especially if you've never done something like that before. So the activation pattern becomes different. There are structural changes in the extracellular matrix, like integrin proteins, et cetera. There's changes in the immune system, potentially. Immune system, it's what it does. It learns about previous inflammatory insults. It learns. So various ways that this repeated effect they all probably kind of collude together to make it such that you get better, and you get less muscle soreness and less injury when you come back and do that. But that's highly variable too, from what I've seen. I've been sore for like 40 years now, since I've been training. Like, I'm always sore. It really never goes, no matter how much I whittle down my training volume, I still notice, there's still some residual soreness there. And then some people, they're hardly ever sore, or maybe never sore, right?
Very rarely sore myself.
Very,
Yeah.
very, and you're like, why am I'm not doing enough, right? So, and we can talk about that, was another question you had. So there's that the insights from the repeated bout effect suggest various other mechanisms that play a role as to whether you still have elevated recovery processes that may even if when you come back to train 3, 4, 5 days later, you still haven't fully recovered. So you've got that pulling you backwards in terms of making progress. And eventually, if you wait till those recovery processes have stopped, then you've no longer got the stimulating effect. Protein synthesis is long since shut off. Satellite cell movement may be done in 5, 6, 7 days. There's hardly any data on that. I keep on looking. So you may be kind of in a catch-22 in that, well, shit, I no longer have a stimulus that's driving hypertrophy, but I haven't quite recovered. So I have to train again, and train in the limited amount with stimulating reps by coming closer to failure, stimulating time under tension. And then that's how you run up against your limit to some degree, how much you can actually do. So Ronnie Coleman is a good example, really. Ronnie Coleman was just ridiculous in the gym, right? He's the GOAT. But if you look, you don't see Ronnie, and he was, people say he trained sloppy. There was some momentum there, but I had the sense just in watching him that he had a really good mind-muscle connection. He was training ballistically. We can get into the physiology of what's happening during movements like that. It's not actually the worst way to create tension across a concentric, eccentrically coupled contraction. But he trained with so much volume, and people forget this. I remember when he first won his first Olympia, and it was actually King Kamali that I'm thinking of right now. He had an interview. It's like, everyone's like, what happened with Ronnie? Like, he made this dynamic. He wasn't even on the radar for winning the Olympia when he first won. In the Battle for the Olympia videos, they didn't even interview him. He went by and
Wow.
looked at 12 or 15 other, and then because Ronnie wasn't even in the running, no one's thinking about Ronnie Coleman winning this thing, so they got him afterwards. You can go watch that video. And King Kamali was like, so people are like, okay, like Ronnie's training the 3-way split twice a week with bubble. People started trying to do that. No one could do it. No one could recover from it.
Yeah.
right? Even though he doesn't train to failure. So he was incurring so many inroads into recovery, but for him, they were much smaller because of his genetics, his just the way he's just a workhorse, man.
Yeah.
The guy was just, obviously he suffered the consequences. That's a whole other story as to what actually happened there with the surgeries and things, but he could recover but he could get from that really, really hard. He didn't have to train like until he came to like a static failure point, or where you're like, okay, there's no more reps there. Even in that, like the 805-pound squat, the one thing he regretted is he could have got like 2 more reps.
Yeah.
Like even there, like he came up, he had some reps in reserve. So Ronnie, you could say, like, if you analyze bar speed and that sort of thing, you might say Ronnie was training with reps in reserve. I don't know. Like that's a contentious statement. Don't make a clip out of this and put it on Instagram. But he could handle all of those sets. And I don't know what Nick's volume is, so I don't want to overextend, when I'm saying I don't know how many sets he does, but Jordan also does something interesting that maybe we can talk about later, but I've noticed, and I'm not in any way involved with how Jordan's specifically training. We chat every once in a while, but every blue moon. But I notice he does multiple exercises, accumulates volume that way, but he's not doing multiple sets per exercise. He's not doing like 5 sets per exercise.
Yeah.
It's 1 or 2, I think, in many, many cases. People go and see how close I am to reality. But when I've paid attention, you'll see, like, we'll have like 10 slides on Instagram, right? And you'll see it's like just one working set. And that is a nice way to distribute the stimulus across the whole field of motor units in a muscle. And some people may notice this. If you do like just 3 sets of a given exercise versus 3 sets of 3 different exercises, let's say for muscle like the pecs, like the chest, right? You've got clavicular, sternal, et cetera, et cetera. You've got different areas, different angles. You can go into be contentious about whether or not you actually can preferentially hit those, but you can get away with doing an incline, a flat, and a decline press or fly movement. Whereas for someone who gets sore easily like I do, just doing 3 sets of incline on a given day would noticeably create soreness the next day, the 2 days later. I'm like, okay, that was too, like, I'll recover eventually. It's not going to kill me, right? But I can get away with doing 3 sets if I change the exercises, because the activation patterns are differently. You see this in MRIs. There's a great book. There's 2 books actually by a Scandinavian Swedish researcher named Per Tesch. Muscle Meets Magnet and Target Bodybuilding, I think, is the name of the other. You can get these still on Amazon. And he may lay out some various ideas on training, but a large part of the book is just documentation of the different patterns of activation that you see with an MRI in doing different exercises, right? Like, do you get the inner or outer head of the quadrant or the gastrocnemius, depending on how you place your foot when you're doing calf raises, or external, internal rotation in terms of medial or lateral quad during a knee extension, those sorts of things. He's got information in there showing there are some subtle differences. So that probably plays a role in that phenomenon that I've noticed, where you mixing up the exercises, and probably I'm guessing what Jordan might be doing is that he can get away with more volume, more stimulating reps, because he trains so hard, by having more variety in there and distributing the insult across those fibers in different ways, rather than, it's kind of like hitting a nail with a hammer. And if you just kept on hitting the one side, you might even see the nail doesn't go in straight, it gets bent. But if you distribute how you hit the nail, you're more likely to get it all the way in there. So that's a really crude analogy, I know, but hopefully that conveys the idea in some way.
Oh, so much to cover there, Scott.
Okay.
I have lots of thoughts.
All right, yeah, please. I'll give you some time.
One of the things you mentioned there was interesting, is in regards to like it's kind of that stimulus to fatigue trade-off, and there might become a point for, I could see it, an individual or even a muscle on an individual, where the stimulus you need to generate is above the kind of fatigue that you can manage, or along those lines. So it's just like you're butting heads. Like, you can't go there.
Mm-hmm.
You can't give enough stimulus because fatigue is catching up to you for whatever
Mm-hmm.
reason. Joint connective tissues. Like, I think that's a lot of reasons why people probably end up injuring, I don't know, various aspects, because they're trying to grow that muscle, but the joint and connective tissue gives up
Mm-hmm.
before they're able to like really get the most from it. The other thought that comes to mind is like muscle growth potential. And that's something
Mm-hmm.
I've been thinking about for a while. Just like, for someone who has a higher muscle growth potential, they're more likely to recomp. They don't need as much volume. They don't have to train as hard. And you could almost, like, that's more novice individuals, of course, but then there's genetic differences and like lifestyle differences, of course. And then even within an individual, like for me, like, I know it's a running joke on the podcast that my biceps just grow. Like, I don't have to do anything for them. They just grow really well. Whereas I hammer my quads like nothing.
Uh-huh.
And so, like, I could probably just grow my biceps through my back work, to be honest with you. They'd grow fine, but my quads are not going to do that through like easy leg training. They're not at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of see that with what you were saying versus maybe Jordan's at that point where he has to, like, that 3 RER is no longer meeting a threshold for growth. Like, it might a more novice individual or someone who's got more growth potential. He's so near his growth like ceiling that, like, he has to push to the absolute limit almost to break through that stress or meet that threshold for growth, which is sufficient stress in a way.
Yeah. There's that whole aspect from the training perspective. And then one of the things, especially more so nowadays, where people are posting themselves on Instagram and you're kind of flooded with what the algorithm sends you in terms of these just like unreachable physiques, the pros, etc., is the other side. And this is poorly, at least in terms of long-term studies. There's some more research coming out in this regard, but in the long haul, over the long haul, when you got someone who's gotten past the intermediate stage and they're pretty advanced and they're really trying to, natural or enhanced, they're really trying to push the limits of their muscle size. Those things you just said, and I said, they still apply. But that recovery side of things is a place where I think people miss out a lot. And part of that can be simply the ability, and this is going to depend on how your body responds to a caloric excess, how well your GI can handle this, but simply the ability to push your body weight up. To some degree, of course, you're just going to have a horrible P ratio. You're not going to repartition. You're just going to get fatter and fatter and fatter. And it makes sense, especially if you want to compete the next year. It's like, okay, now like I'm gaining, 2 grams of muscle for every 1,000 grams of body fat. This is not a good ratio. This is just pushing me the wrong direction. But if someone had 5 years to take their time and bring themselves up from, I'm going to just use pounds, but from 200 pounds to 220 pounds over 5 years. And they could do that. They could manage that. And it would never have reached that 220 pounds. That is an untapped and unseen, like, rock that could be turned over in terms of enhancing the recovery side of things, making sure the calories are there. I always harken back to this too. Like, if you look at the methodology we use for looking at protein synthesis, how variable the values are, the fractional myofibrillar synthesis rates that you see across studies. There's a pretty wide range that gets published. But if you look at how many grams of protein need to be incorporated into skeletal muscle as myofibrillar protein, let's presume, in order to gain massive amounts of weight, literally, like, I think it's like 7 grams of protein would give you roughly an ounce of muscle per day, which is like over 20 pounds of muscle over the course of a year, right? That's a very subtle shift in protein balance, right? For someone who's taking in 200 grams of protein a day, just to get 4 or 5 more grams incorporated on a daily basis, kind of religiously, repeatedly, consistently, day in and day out for 5 years, even if it's 2 grams, do the math. That's 20 pounds of muscle. That's 1% of the total protein intake. That's a very, very teensy shift in protein balance. We're not going to see that in an acute study looking at protein synthesis rates in response to some intervention, some supplement or different type of training, or even over the course of 6, 8, 10, 12 weeks. That's a very small amount. So the guys that, and you see this a lot in the enhanced realm, but I think in part because it becomes more obvious and there's much more muscle that can be accrued when you're enhanced. Like, the biggest guys in the natural world are maybe 200 pounds on stage. That's a big dude.
Yeah.
And we got people coming in at 300 pounds, in the IFBB. There's just a absolute universe of differences there. But pushing the body weight up and be willing to do that each year, trying to get higher and higher, and not just saying, last year I was 240 and this year I'm going to hit 300 pounds. That often doesn't work for people, but accumulating that muscle over time is one thing that it's not for everyone, but it may be an unturned rock in the pebblescape of rocks that could be turned over to make good gains. There are other issues with PEDs that can accumulate, like lots of growth hormone and IGF-1 if you're using that, and then you get a larger abdominal growth. Potentially you get roid gut or what have you. Then you run then the other problems there that can come with all that food. So it still comes down to how well your muscle will respond to that caloric excess. But it's a very, very calorically expensive phenomenon to gain muscle mass. It takes a lot of calories. And I think a lot of people stop short of what they could potentially get, but it would not necessarily be pretty. It might be that extra 5 pounds of muscle comes with 15 pounds of fat. That's a horrible P ratio. It doesn't look or feel good. And people run up against what Jordan has run up against when you get really big, is you just can't train as hard.
Yep.
When you get heavier. So I'm talking about sort of that proportion of people that aren't at Jordan's level or Nick's level, but are somewhere below that, who are keeping themselves, at 12% body fat all the time, which is not, and it's hey, that could be, it's probably much healthier, but to some degree, just pointing people in the direction of gaining muscle mass is going to come with some gain of body weight, especially with like weak muscle groups. I'll end my little rant here, but one of the common questions I get on my discussion board is about bringing up weak muscle groups, and sort of a stereotypical scenario would be someone who has, their arms aren't, unlike you, the arms aren't a strength, right? And they made good gains for the first couple of years, and they've been at it for 2 more years, and everything else seems to be growing decently well. They're kind of happy with it, but their arms aren't growing. And in those last 2 years, they've only gained 5 pounds of body weight. It's like, okay, so you're going to have to make everything get bigger, and your arms are going to continue to lag because they're your lagging muscle group. So you're going to have to maybe get even, at least potentially, more out of balance to some degree to finally get your arms to grow. And that's going to mean you're going to have to go beyond 185 pounds. You may have to go above 200 pounds to make that happen. And that's doable. That's not 300. That's not 275. That's doable for some people. But that's maybe beyond what their internal governor says. Yeah, I don't want to get fat. I don't want to have to buy new clothes. I don't like how I look. I want to be ready to take my shirt off at, any moment, or what have you. So, but that's the thing I think that is ultimately a limiter in many cases. It's just the willingness and ability to push body weight up so that you got the insulin there. You've got a surplus of amino acids. You've got protein synthesis driven the extra 1%, let's say, for over the course of years, that then leads to the extra 4 or 5 pounds of muscle that you wouldn't have had otherwise. Yeah.
In at least a social media day and age where bulking is dead and being in a surplus is kind of poo-pooed a little bit, although that might be me straw-manning some people's arguments. I think often they say they don't agree with bulking, but they do agree with a surplus. And it's like, well, I kind of view bulking as a surplus, but I digress. I wonder, Scott, the way I picture this, and feel free to kind of pick holes at this kind of argument, where I kind of think of it as first principling it, is the training is, I think of training as the match that lights the fire for muscle growth. Nutrition is then just permissive of that growth. So you want to provide the nutrition there, but the training has to be in place first. So I really encourage people to get to a level of body fat or like a body weight where they feel very good, they can be productive in the gym, and then have a small steady surplus there and kind of live in this kind of, I call it like a body weight or body fat sweet spot, which I don't know. For men, it might be like low teens into like high teens and like travel in there, like you cut back down once you're up at the upper
Sure.
end and like live in that zone. Do you think that's a good way of like thinking about it for people where they're
Yeah.
like, oh, I don't know, I thought I could just recomp the whole time.
Yeah. Yeah. I think in the social media world, and that's how you started that off, if people have potentially unrealistic expectations of what average genetics will allow. Chris Barakat, I think you've had Chris on before. Yeah, I
Yeah.
thought so. Like he has that paper. We talked about this. He was on my podcast. We talked about this a little bit on that podcast. Is there are people who will come into these studies that will recomp. It's demonstrated multiple times. And there are people who you've got your buddy who you've been training with and doing that. You're eating that. You're using the same intra workout and you're going to the eat afterwards. And he's growing and you're not, right? For most people, I think that's what you said is absolutely really good approach. Um, the thing is if you look at the grand scheme of what each person is doing on an individual basis, you mentioned not wanting the straw man. Some of the studies that have come out, at least one particular study I'm thinking about, where the surplus didn't produce any more increase in fat-free mass. Maybe there was a ceiling effect there. Those are obviously averages, but if you look, and I'm big at being aware of the potential for cherry picking in a certain way, finding studies where you see a principle kind of supported that you want to believe in, and a version of that maybe potentially it's a logical fallacy is, I don't think so though, is looking at the individual in each of those studies. If you look, and more and more studies are doing this, I absolutely love it. You see the individual data points and you'll see the variability. There will people in some of those studies that did do better, would have done better with the caloric excess if you had a crossover potentially. And then some of them maybe would have done worse. Maybe they felt so horrible and they couldn't sleep because they were so full, and their training went to the shitter because they were eating so much. They just didn't feel good. And there's a huge component with how hard you train, how hard you stick to dotting the I's and crossing the T's, with how good you feel about what you're doing. Right? If you have this internal resistance to, I don't want to eat this meal. This isn't how I don't identify with being the person who is just pounding the food like a barbarian because I'm going to become the biggest, baddest mofo in my gym. I just feel fat and out of shape, and people are asking me if I don't lift anymore, and it's not fun. Well, then that just affects everything, even if it's just through placebo effect mechanisms. So there will be, I think, though, some people, if you take a closer look and you see that maybe their calories, they are living on poverty calories, or they're not really eating as much as they could, they could put 500 more calories in per day, and make a substantial difference because they're eating 10 calories per pound per day, which is what many people would need to diet, right? But they've been doing that.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of one person right now who's sort of is perpetually in diet mode, has been kind of for years. That person has an extraordinary physique, so it doesn't come to the surface like, oh wow, I got to change something because they look great, they look phenomenal. But some other people might be in that situation. They like being lean, but they want more muscle mass. It's like you're going to have to come out of that low calorie intake, which really isn't a deficit because they're stable, and start adding calories slowly. Your metabolism there'll be some adaptation that'll happen there. Your NEAT will go up, et cetera, et cetera. So there will be people that need more calories, and then the others who can do exactly what you're saying. They can stay in that, the Goldilocks zone there, so to speak, where everything's perfect and nice, and continue to grow. And that you can do that for years and years and years. I think for natural guys, you've got maybe a 5-year window where you're going to get the large chunk of the muscle mass as long as you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's and doing everything. And then beyond that, that's where some guys will hop on, or then you may think, okay, we'll see what my genetics will allow. I may just get fat if I try to push the calories for too long. You don't see this very often. There was one person I saw on Intense Muscle years and years and years ago, and I wish I can't remember the person's online name, but this guy was getting really, really strong remember he would do leg presses with like 10 plates on a side, and he was going all the way down where he could have licked his patella. He was like literally super deep, full range of motion before that was even a thing. But he didn't seem to care. He was just like, I'm going to just perma bulk and get brutally strong. Like some powerlifters do. They don't care. Like, I got the interstitial leverage. Give me the fat. I'll take it. Right. I just want to be as strong as anything. And I never saw him diet himself down. But that's the purely hypothetical scenario that like you rarely see someone intentionally engage in, where you say, you know what? I'm going to give myself 5 years. And this as a natural competitor, like Chris, for instance, and like many guys, it's like you can't compete every year because you need 2 years to gain 2 pounds of muscle. It's not going to happen, right? So, but you also want to still be a competitor. So like, how long do you wait? No one's going to wait 5 years, right? And unless you have a layoff and you end up just kind of perma bulking because it becomes your lifestyle or what have you, and then you come back. But so that's the rock that might not be turned over for some people, but not everyone. And I tell you, like, if it would be interesting, you can't obviously do this, but it would be interesting if you could maybe hypnotize someone or take people who are in that situation where they're not satisfied with how they look, and all of a sudden just transform them into looking the way they want to look, where they'd be satisfied. That desire to gain more muscle mass would go away. They'd be totally happy. So people with really good genetics might be able to get even better. This is actually something I think is often the case for several reasons, is people with really good genetics may have, in some cases, more room for growth than those people who have lesser genetics, because the lesser genetically gifted people are those who do everything they can to maximize their genetics. They just have a lower ceiling.
Yeah.
And the people with the better genetics end up much, much better. And they're like, this is awesome. I just got to go and make sure I go in there coast 2 or 3 times a week. I'm having Snickers bars after my workout and what have you. And they actually, although they're much better than 90% of the people, they could actually be, at the world elite. And then when those two things combine, you got people like Ronnie, right? Or a lot of the guys who are the top of the IFBB, or even the probably best 50 IFBB open pros. Those guys have phenomenal genetics, and they're, I would say, in large part, are doing everything they possibly can. But I bet there's a whole other contingent of guys who are close to that, who could really, really up the ante. Yeah.
I completely see it. When I think about it, I think like someone who's average but works for longer and harder than the average person suddenly makes themselves not average. And then the person who is above average, if they just work how the average person does, they're just above average. They kind of meet at the same point. And then you have the people who work just as hard as the person who's average or even below, but they have the above average genetics, and they are your Ronnie Colemans, and they're kind of winning everything. And they're quite rare in that sense, because like you said, people do get complacent and they get comfortable. They're just like, oh, this is easy. And sometimes they need a loss or something like that to kind of give them a kick up the arse or something to kind of send them in the right direction, or a coach. But often they, because results have come easy to them, they don't think they need a coach, and they think they know better sometimes, and that's a tough one. So it's hard to get those individuals. Like Terrence Ruffin comes to mind as someone who I interact with him, and he's absorbing loads of information. He's always trying to get better, and obviously he's genetically very gifted, but he doesn't put on muscle super easily, from my understanding of having spoken to him. So he is like, to me, he's that person who obviously he's above average, but he's also giving really above average efforts. And it's great to see him. I don't know your thought, the complete tangent. How did you think the Olympia went for him?
I tell you, I mean, I saw an interview. He got interviewed by Rep 1, David Hoffmann. He was a classic physique competitor from Germany. He's really well known in the German scene, but he's one of the main, he does interviews with Stefan Kienzel, who's well known, Stefan, I imagine, coaches Urs.
Yeah.
Bunch of.
Oh yeah, he's a character. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah. He does a lot of interviews in English too. But David interviewed Terrence for Rep 1. So probably a lot of people didn't catch that interview because it was in English, of course. But he intentionally took last year off if I'm remembering correctly, and he was 11 pounds heavier this year.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he was willing to take that time off and grow, and I tell you, I mean, I watched it, and it was a very contentious with the whole weight or the height controversy and all that kind of stuff. I have interesting thoughts on that because I have a unique position in that I speak German and I understand what was said, and like I paid attention to Mike Sommerfeld. Um, and I could talk about that in a second. But anyway, Terrence, I tell you, in seeing that top three, I could have seen Terrence winning. I really think like he's just shorter,
Yeah.
but when you just look at like his conditioning was spot on, his proportions, his frame was filled out. And did you see his posing routine?
No one poses better than Terrence. Like it was, I
Oh,
don't think there's been a better posing routine.
I tell you, I won't argue. It reminded me of Lee Labrada. Lee Labrada's done some posing routines
Yeah.
and I imagine Terrence has studied him extensively. I'm just guessing, or maybe just genius, collided here at the same spot, through separate paths. Um, but yeah, the interesting thing with Mike, and he had said some things in interviews that maybe, weren't the best politically, but if you look at what Neil Hill said, if you saw Neil's interview,
I
um,
haven't seen it, no.
so and Mike had mentioned this, yeah, because I followed along with this. Mike had mentioned that he was stretching, maybe he had some chiropractic, but was making intentional efforts to increase his height, right? And I'd heard him say that, and then he came in and he said in one interview that he was talking to Dennis James in German. I'm really 170 or 171 centimeters, but they height me in at 173. And of course, the 5'9¼ is like 175 point something. And Neil made the point that last year, when they knew he needed to be heighted in, they were doing things on a daily basis to make sure he made height. And this year, of course,
Wow.
they had the pass. That was an interview that Neil gave. It may have been with a Brazilian reporter. I'm not sure, but it was on Nick Strength and Power. And Ben Wellen is a German guy, lives in Mexico, I think now. He's a buddy of Mike's. Mike's trained with him. He's an older guy. He's really well known in the non-IFBB circles. The guy's like a champ. He's competed for like 40 plus years. He has a small podcast, and he actually said in German that Mike had told him that he had found out that his spine was crooked. Krumm was the word he used, and that he had a way to straighten it back out.
Wow.
He did, and Ben didn't know what it was, but Mike had told him, and through messages, that they had figured it out, how to do this. I would presume that meant that he had scoliosis of some sort, right? I don't know, but I haven't heard Mike address any of that. That got misreported as if Mike had got an operation done on another
Oh,
channel. And that's where the idea of an operation happened. So anyway, it was really interesting. Like
Chinese whistles.
it was so interesting, like listening to Ben say what he said and then seeing someone not even read the subtitles that basically say, no, he didn't say anything about an operation, and seeing German say, I'm German. Ben didn't mention an operation, but still like, oh, he got where's the scars? I don't believe him. So anyway, yeah, that was a really, really interesting insight into how social media works, how notions get spread, how kind of rumors or information gets disseminated. For me, from my perspective, and I have the advantage, I speak German, I could hear what was being said directly, but it's like, this is pretty clear. They were doing everything they could so that he could hide it in. There could have been some monkey business too that I don't know about, but there was a clear explanation from Neil and from what Mike had said and what Ben had said that Mike had told him, but that didn't make its way out. And I don't know who did what. Maybe I mean, who knows? I'm not saying that everyone else was wrong and Mike was right, or vice versa. I don't
Sure.
know, but it's like, oh, that's interesting. Like that's a completely logical explanation that makes like, now medically, could you get an extra 3 centimeters? Well, it depends on how bad your scoliosis was potentially. You can stretch people out, maybe get a centimeter. Like I'm not an expert I'm not an orthopedist, right? Um, I don't know what Mike did exactly, but it's just kind of funny to watch the dynamics online of the whole thing as it's spun out of control.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I could see, I only caught bits of it, but I could see Mike getting quite irritated by the height topic. And
Yeah.
man, yeah, fake news spreads fast, and it's
Yeah.
dangerous in that sense as
Mhm.
well. This is a complete tangent in some regard. Keon Prodigy looked
Yeah.
incredible. The only critique I can really think of that people have on him is I forget what it's called, but the gap
Diastasis
between his
recti. Yeah.
yes, that's the one. I also have this, but
Yeah.
not
Me
at the
too.
extent here. Keon's is like 4 times as large as mine. I think you could probably fit 4 fingers almost
Mhm.
between his, maybe 3. But is that something that can be repaired? Do you think he needs to? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there is a surgery that can be done for that. I don't know what the recovery is like.
Mm,
Um, so he had a gyno surgery that was made public, and like there was no pictures like, oh wow, he's really downsized. But I don't know how long his recovery was. But there is a surgery for there's a surgery for pretty much everything.
yeah, true.
Um, yeah, I'm so used to seeing that, and I have it myself, and I've seen it so much. It's kind of like it's just kind of one of those things. It's like, okay, this guy's losing his hair. Like, so what? Like, he's got a
Yeah,
diastasis, right? It's not, but that's literally maybe because his symmetry and structure is just so phenomenal that you're like, oh, there's a little fleck of dirt on that diamond. I want to get rid of that
yes,
because it's just bugging me because otherwise it's perfect, right?
yeah,
Um, but yeah, I don't know. I'm sure he's probably had numerous surgeons say, "Hey, I can take care of that for you." Um, but yeah, that the thing about that, I would imagine, I don't know. This is just pure. It's just you two guys just chatting. Is like, I mean that happens because of intra-abdominal pressure and of course distension when he's training under pressure, maybe even continuous, and eventually you just get some stretching of that the connective tissue, the fascia there. So I would imagine that if you got that repaired, the goal would be to limit any and all mechanical stresses, which would then reverse the
yeah.
repair. So he'd have to, they might even put him on a low fiber diet, make sure he doesn't get constipated.
Wow.
Who knows?
Wow.
Like they would probably want to avoid anything that could give gastric distension. Probably no training at all. I don't know if they'd have him wear a corset or something like that
Yeah.
too. They do that with gyno surgery. You wear like a vest to hold the
Okay.
tissue in
Yeah.
place for X number of weeks. So he would probably be out of training for a while. And he's making his open debut, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So against Martin Fitzwater, who ironically beat Chris Bumstead when Chris stepped in the open.
Yes.
So, and Martin was, I think, 5th this year. So it's going to be a really interesting test to see. I just want to see how they look together, those two
Yeah.
side by side.
Because Martin also has very good shape. So, but it's not on Keon's level. Keon is like, I don't know anyone who has better shape than Keon. Like
Yeah.
he is an X frame.
It's mind boggling, right? Yeah.
But it's yeah, I can imagine he's thought about repairing that, but I
Mm-hmm.
think he does a very good job in his poses of hiding it. It's only when you like fully really look for it, like you said, you kind of notice
Mm-hmm.
it.
Yeah.
And a lot of competitors have it. It's like you said, because everything else is so perfect,
Mm-hmm.
it
Right.
kind of, you notice it.
It's the
Whereas I
flaw.
think there's probably
Yeah.
many who have it and it's nothing there. Was there anything on that first question with the
Oh.
difference between Nick and Jordan Peters? I guess if I
Mm-hmm.
was just to kind of completely flip back to that, do you think the main difference and why Nick maybe can quote unquote get away with leaving some reps in the tank and still meet a growth threshold is because maybe he can handle more volume and has a just better growth propensity than maybe Jordan, who has to train that much harder and then can't do as much?
That would be my running theory is
Yeah.
that Nick gets a stimulus, and we gotta keep this in mind here. Like Nick can train really hard. He's been training for a long time. Um, and it's interesting. I hear people say, like, in a very basic fashion, like the muscle just knows tension, right? And it's like, okay, but you're ignoring all of the intricacies of what happens during concentric versus eccentric contractions, the lifting, the lowering, the quote unquote squeeze, the mind muscle connection. Activation varies across different I mean, there's interesting studies, like, this is like a little deep dive, little side of deep dive, of Henneman size principle. I'm sure
Yeah,
yeah.
sure.
So for folks who don't know, there's basically a really well established orderly pattern of recruitment from low threshold motor units to higher threshold motor units as force requirements go up, or as fatigue ensues, whereby you'll need more motor units in order to maintain force output or work output for a given task. So a lot of that's been demonstrated with small muscles of the hand, and you can actually see that when you ask people to do different things with their thumb and you measure the muscles, the thenar muscles of the hand, you can see some shifting of the order of recruitment. So let's say you have motor unit A, B, and C, and usually it goes A, B, C in that order, and you have someone do a certain movement with their hand, and then you change the movement. You can see sometimes for some movement comparisons that it goes ACB, right? It's still like, from going alphabetically, generally speaking. It's not like we're going from A to Z to Q to bouncing around the alphabet, but there's some orderly recruitment. So things can change depending on what the central command is, what the movement is, how you're executing the movement. And people have been training for a long time. For instance, you could do a leg press. Just take a leg press where the sled travels in a plane because it's on the runner. It's like it's not gonna, you're not gonna pull it back on you. It's not gonna fall forward. It's not like with the squat where you have a balance component, right? You can do a leg press. Put your feet in one spot on a leg press and push with your quads, right? You could also keep your feet in that exact same place and dig your heels in and try to activate your glutes and make that more of a gluteus exercise as well. Then the muscle, mind muscle connection studies we have, for instance, with triceps versus pecs, doing bench press exercises show that people, especially those who are more experienced, can do that. They can shift, at least with the lighter loads. You get to where it's too heavy and you can no longer, you just need to activate everything. But
Yeah.
you can say, do this with your triceps this time, do this with your pecs this time, and the EMGs will substantiate that people actually can selectively recruit muscles in a kinetic chain like that, willfully, with a mind-muscle connection. So Nick may have figured out, like, tempo-wise, the faster you go, the more motor units you need just to move away quickly. With a slow, controlled tempo and a squeeze, how to create a recruitment pattern which is stimulatory for him, for his genetics, based on how he trains with his tempo and being very, very focused and not going to failure. That because of all those factors that collude in, make that stimulatory for muscle growth for him. And then he can do more of those sets and he can still recover, the other things we talked about. But the nature of, he's figured out, and this is after years and years and years of training, how to make a set, how to activate a muscle in a certain way. And that probably has to do with tempo and feel, all these things that are really, really hard to distinguish with basic tools. At least I don't know how it will be done with EMGs, for instance, to be able to pick out those subtle nuances that just occur over the course of years of figuring out what works for your training. But Nick's found his own particular solution where he can get a stimulus out of a set where he's not going to blinding failure. And it could be too that, like, once you get, and this fits with the mind muscle connection and that Henneman size principle, the more effort, the more you're going to have to activate those higher threshold motor units. And at some point, over the course of a set, let's say, when you get to those last reps, you're probably activating all of them, right? But there's also an on and off. There's a sharing of the load amongst those motor units, such that we've got, let's say, low threshold and high threshold. And initially, when those high thresholds start to be involved in and this is from isometric fatiguing experiments. So I'm taking this into the realm of dynamic contractions with isotonic loads and resistance exercise. So it's not a perfect one-to-one. but some of those motor units will come on and then some of them will turn off. So they come in and they come out, so that the ones when they turn off and they're no longer being activated at a certain frequency, they can recover. So they share, it's like a tag team basically amongst all sorts of motor units. And when you finally get to where you're close to failure, the only way you can do those reps is you've got to activate everything that's possibly there. So that those subtle nuances, which would be involved with being able to have a mind muscle connection, use more triceps versus more pecs, those no longer apply. So you're no longer able to selectively activate the muscle you're trying to hit in the way you want if you're at failure. You're just doing everything you possibly can. And that's the explanation why form a lot of times breaks down when people, you can have, there's various ways you can define muscle failure, right?
Yeah.
The form failure, it was his inability to get the load from point A to point B, and there's everything in between. But he may be stopping 1 or 2 reps shy of failure, may literally be the failure point of his ability with the mind muscle connection and the training technique he's used, where he can no longer apply that very effective way of stimulating hypertrophy. He would have to go to at least not visibly mechanically sloppy reps, neurologically sloppy activation patterns, which I think potentially are, because the nervous system is one potential mechanism of why we do have this repeated bout effect, or why you're doing, let's say, deadlifts, rack deads, and all of a sudden you go a little bit deeper, or you add a band or add chains, and all of a sudden you get really sore, even though your sets and reps were the same. It's a different neurological activation pattern. So the return on investment for Nick, let's say, in those last couple reps, because in order to do those and go to failure, so to speak, where the weight no longer moves, he would be so neurologically sloppy that may also in him incur damage or whatever's going into the injury and soreness phenomena that we see, in a way that it's the return on investment is too shitty. Like, it doesn't make any sense. It's like, you're gambling, you're winning. It's like, okay, time to take your win and go home. End the set. You've gotten what you needed. And for Jordan, stopping that at that point, maybe he wouldn't do it. Or maybe Jordan, the way he trains, and no way would I ever change Jordan in terms of trying to find every way possible to grow. But it may be, and that when he took on a reps and reserve type of training strategy, again, as we said, like training in that way with a mind muscle connection and stopping short of failure, like there was literally no return on investment for him. Or maybe he just, because he's so advanced now, at this point, after all the training, everything he's done, even if somehow magically you could take Nick's skill set and give it to Jordan so that he could train in the way that Nick does. Let's say Nick has a magical, learned, experiential mind muscle connection so that he can get stimulating reps when he's shy of failure. You give Jordan that skill set, and it still doesn't help him because he's so advanced relative to his genetic limit. So even if he trained the way Nick did and he could optimize, it still wouldn't help him because he's already past that point of development.
Yeah.
So
that makes a lot of sense. I'm just thinking through myself. I went through a period of time where I was very kind of mind muscle connection, technique focused, and it would be a technical failure point, not like a local muscle failure point as such. And I moved away from that, allowed my technique to look less than pristine, but still kind of within the realms of like acceptable visually. You still think it looks good, and focus more on just like working hard, being aggressive. I grew way better. The difference would be like 4 or 5 reps difference. It's kind of like doing a length and partial pull down versus full ROM. You could have maybe got 5 more if you did more partials. And again, that's just that extra growth stimulus that I think is knocking me above my kind of threshold for growth that maybe I was kind of shortchanging myself before, which makes sense with everything you were mentioning there. And I have some clients, sometimes they talk about how they can like do a lighter load and have a good mind muscle connection, or they can do heavier load and fine technique, but like they don't feel the muscle as in the same way. And I just had this discussion today with a client. I was like, hey, I didn't know why it came up for him just recently, but I was like, we could start the set with that kind of mind muscly connection, like feeling good. And then once you hit like the wall with that, now you get, and that's kind of what I end up doing with my sets, where I'm like, whereas I used to stop them almost to that point where I was like, oh, things have switched off. Whereas now I'm like, nah, they've switched off like here, because my body's like, you just have to use everything now. And that's okay, as long as I'm safe.
I mentioned this. I said just in one of the last few podcasts I did, like you can actually do sets that way. And you could even logbook the mind muscle connection portion of the set, so to speak. Like, this is what I got when I felt that good connection. And then like literally it's like, okay, now I flipped the turbo switch, and you may have gotten 10 reps, you get another 5. And you basically you're giving yourself force reps to some degree. You're bringing in accessory muscles. You're giving a little bit of body English to the movement, and you can give yourself a little bit of assistance on the concentric. And still, this is not something you're going to probably teach someone in the first 3 months of lifting, right? But when you've at it for a while, it's like, okay, I'm learning how to get into rhythm of helping myself down with the weight or up with the weight concentrically. And then I'm going to make sure that I'm lowering it with the muscle I'm trying to target as much as possible. So that muscle, literally, it's as if like you put some electrodes on there and you slap that muscle, and the muscle is still going, right? It doesn't have enough in it in order to get more reps. So you allow those reps to happen by loosening up your form, and then the reps still happen. You still got a mind muscle connection, but you're basically saying, okay, we can cheat a little bit here now. That's what cheat reps are about, right? Joe Weider had it all figured out, Steve. We should have paid closer attention. But I think there's something to that. But I think that the problem with doing is you need to be disciplined if you're going to do that, and say, okay, these are the good reps, these are the sloppy reps. I may be incurring some more damage, neurological fatigue, what have you, by doing these extra, crazy reps. So pay attention to the difference when people are logbooking and they start off their blast or their macrocycle or microcycle, mesocycle, and their form is good, and then they go, and then by the end of their they're getting more reps with heavier weight, but their form's gotten sloppy. Well, it's like, well, then your performance in the gym isn't reflective of the muscle mass that you're trying to grow. You just changed your form. You're doing your reps faster and sloppier. So so you got to be disciplined.
Yeah, for sure. I think it reminds me of something that I see kind of come in and out. It's like notoriously done on like hack squats, and people are progressing it for, I don't know, ages, but they're just adding rest pauses. Like they hit failure 4 reps ago, but they're just taking like 20 seconds up at the top. They're like, yeah, I beat last week, I'm growing. It's like, well, like you are adding a stimulus for sure. And if you're recovering from it, hey, I haven't got a problem. But sometimes that trade-off, like you said, just starts to become not worth it.
That's why in fortitude training, there's 3 set types. It's a daily undulated periodization. We've kind of talked about that without saying that using that term. But when you do your reps, they're all continuous. So that you like the rest pause or the cluster sets, the muscle rounds, it's a discontinuous cluster set. But while you're doing the reps, you don't pause.
Yeah.
And you remind me of something a long time ago, and I'm like, oh, this makes sense. But for some reason, people were catching on to it. I don't remember who this person was. It was a female powerlifter who was really, really good at University of Texas at Austin. Jan and Terry Todd. Terry is now passed on, but they coached that team for years and years. Jan is still there. They have an amazing strength history museum. And I was the TA for the weight training classes that they taught. So I got to hang out with the powerlifters a little bit, and I would train with them a few times. And they had a very standard way of training and logbooking, where they would do, like, before powerlifting meets, they do sets of 10, sets of 5, and sets of 3, right? And there's prediction equations. You can say, when you're able to do 5 reps with this is 82% of your 1 rep max or what have you. You've got an idea where it should be. And there was this one really, really good powerlifter, and she was doing her sets of 3 with whatever, let's say she was squatting 275 pounds. And for some reason, it wasn't translating when she got up on the platform. And I remember watching her train, and like when she did her sets of 5, she basically was doing 5 singles with 20 seconds in between. Her
Oh,
sets
wow.
would, I was like, what's she doing? Like she did a rep, and I'm like, oh, okay, she's just doing a single. But she couldn't have done 2 reps in a row. But she had gotten
Yeah.
so good. And I mean, the mental strength to do that, to just stay under the bar and like do kind of like a super heavy Widowmaker with all those. But she was still getting she wanted to use as much weight as possible during that, through that 10 rep, 5 rep, 3 rep scheme. But she wasn't doing the rep continuously. So she was basically lifting like 97% of her 1 rep max for 5 reps with huge, rest intervals. So yeah, exactly. That's so common, and I've done that. I did that for probably a decade, man, when I was doing DC
Yeah.
training, just because the logbook was going to be my biatch, and I was going
Yeah.
to, take it down no matter what. And, you win those battles, but you don't win the war on muscle mass if you just keep deceiving yourself like that.
For sure. Yeah,
Yeah.
man, that sounds it is brutal, and it does, just like training to failure teaches you then if you can grow from leaving a bit more in the tank. Actually, that's something I keep coming as a thought in my head to say to you.
Yes.
Is obviously people will be thinking, hey, the research, we had the meta regressions where people are growing with like 3-4 reps in reserve, maybe even more if they're training heavy enough. Do you think the reason, like it's the reason the research is showing that, and that you don't necessarily need to train to like failure or 0 RER for the majority of people, is because the people the research is done on, like most people aren't that well trained, like
Yeah.
Jordan, for example?
Yeah. There is something to that. And the basic criticisms of those studies are short lived. They're short. They're 8, 10, 12 weeks. There's actually a meta-analysis I covered on my podcast months ago. Betito, I want to say it's 2020. It could be 2022. But they looked at lean body mass, fat-free mass, across a number of studies. They gathered together. I think there was like 800 some participants across the studies. And I think it was in the fat-free mass comparison. They looked at experience level and the extent to which these studies showed increases in fat-free mass. And it was the same from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 2 to 4, and 4+ years of experience. The increases in fat-free mass was the same. There was no law of diminishing returns, as you would have expected, across the studies in that meta-analysis. And sometimes the studies that are selected, the different selection criteria, so that you can't always compare the results of one to another, especially over time when the studies accumulate. In fact, they mentioned it mathematically, statistically, it was not significant, but mathematically, it even looked like there were greater gains in fat-free mass. It wasn't tapering off in those studies with the more advanced, more experienced trainees. And my kind of contention there was that when you get people who are trained, and that's obviously there's relevance to it. It's very important for people who've been at this for a while. It's like study the people that are more like me, that have been at this for some period of time. But then another way of looking at that is like, so would you subject yourself to going into a study like this and giving someone else the reins for your training? Or is there a selection bias at work in some of those studies with highly trained individuals, such that you're finding people who've been at it and banging their head against the wall for 3, 4, 5+ years and not making the gains that they want? There can also be the criteria they use for, like, have you been, training at least 6 or 9 months out of the year for the last 4 years? Or like there can be people who are very, very irregular with their training, and that could explain it too. But the people who are the more particular and maybe scientifically oriented, wanted to squeeze every last ounce out of their training, are already dotting all the I's and crossing their T's. And maybe not those, unless they're in graduate school and they have no choice. They're a graduate student and they have to do the study. They're not the same as the people in those studies, potentially. This was just my thesis. I didn't see them expand upon that in their discussion in that particular meta-analysis. But so yeah, as far as whether, the more trained you get, the harder you're going to have to train to continue to make gains that almost seems self-evident to me, right? You learn how to train harder as you
Yeah.
go along. So, there's even, I have a whole, I think the law of diminishing returns is probably somewhere in the title of the podcast, but I look a little bit at estimating reps in reserve, and just having done one previous set where they have to estimate and then go to failure dramatically improves how well you can estimate your reps in reserve. So having gone to failure and then knowing what that's really like, and then, I think there's really something to say for maybe if this in the long term wouldn't be the best person to train with, training with someone who, quote unquote, you're okay with me, cursing a little, makes you their bitch,
Yeah.
right? Someone who just like takes you to town, like, oh my God, I thought
Yeah.
I trained hard. That guy, like, I'm not giving that guy an axe because he's going to be chopping people's heads off. This is an axe. This is a monster right here, right? I say that facetiously, but you can learn training effort in a way that you wouldn't just by having been at it for a while and training with other people. And that will completely change your perspective
Yeah.
on what hard training is. And, pain is a component of this. And I'm no expert in pain, but I was just thinking about this the other day. There's this anecdote from when we're doing a muscle soreness study. I don't know if I ever told this on your podcast before. And this was a standardized exercise protocol, eccentric only, one-legged leg press movements. And we just group people based on their activity levels. I think, 3 different categories, and then body weight. So we could just go. We had them, like, I think we had over 80 subjects. We were just running them in flights. And so we're bringing them through, and you could kind of see we weren't totally blinded to what the previous measurements were. And this one guy came in, and I knew because I just was privy to him having been tested on the IsoConnect dynamometer that his strength went way down, right? I caught wind of that, and we're all making multiple measurements. So it wasn't like we had one person do one measurement and they're blinded to all the other measurements. But this was okay. This was a study that we did for a third-party company. And then I was doing a pressure algometry measurement on this guy. So the idea was that they had, and this, just call it quad soreness. There's more details, and so this pressure algometer, you press down with a certain amount of pressure at a certain spot. I think it was where they said they would experience the most soreness, or if not, use a standard if they didn't know. And then you say, okay, what is your pain rating on a 0 to 100 scale? There's a little visual analog scale, and they have to, and he's like, well, it doesn't hurt. And I'm like, I know he's like 20-30% of his previous strength, like the muscle is damaged. This must be painful. I'm like, okay. I said, so there's no pain at all? Like, is there any aspect of what you're feeling that you could consider painful? He's like, so his literally, he went as close to 0 as he was 2 out of 100, right? I think just to kind of comply with what I was asking him to do. And after the study, I said, hey, quick, because it's a super nice guy. I said, question for you. Did you have some painful experiences in your background? I just noticed you had some really low ratings compared to some of the other folks. And he's like, oh yeah, a couple things. And I'm like, oh, like what? And he's like, I had heart problems when I was a kid, and I had to have open chest heart surgery like 3 times, where they cut through your rib cage, which hurts. And then he told me, and this is the one that got me. He's like, I used to be kind of a daredevil, so I was always breaking legs and stuff. And I'm like, oh, really? He's like, so what was the worst one you went through? He's like, well, there's this one time I was on my BMX bike. I was trying to jump over this fence. We had a ramp, and the fence had spiked posts on top, and I didn't quite make it. I flipped, and I landed on the thing, but unfortunately no one was there. So I was lying there impaled for like an hour until someone found me and took me to the hospital. So this guy has literally been impaled on the verge of death. That's a 10 on a pain scale of 0 to 10 for him. We make his quad sore. That's nothing for him.
Nothing.
Right? So pain, one aspect, I mean, obviously there's effort, and how much you can exert yourself, but the pain that you experience at the end of a set of leg press or deadlifts or rack deads or whatever is also going to be relevant. It's going to depend on your experience, your past training experience, other life experiences. So that's something that makes a difference too, as to what really who knows, even with Nick, like for most people, what Nick's doing that's 2 reps in reserve might be training to failure.
Yeah,
in a certain way.
for sure.
He just knows what really training to failure is, and unlike many people do. And it may have just an innately high pain tolerances too, and maybe has life experiences where for him, like going to the gym and, doing squats, that's nothing compared to the time the alligator chewed my leg off, and I had to crawl 5 miles home from the swamp, or whatever. I'm making stories
Yeah.
up. So,
That
yeah,
you
yeah, go ahead.
have said that story before, but
Okay.
I love
Oh,
it every
sorry.
time. I love it every time I hear it, and there'll be a lot of listeners who haven't heard it,
Yeah.
or they enjoy it just the same way as
I
I do. And
exaggerate a little more each time, the older I get, the better the story becomes.
no, you hold pretty true to what I remember at
Okay.
least.
Okay, good.
But I think this it makes me think of some of the like badassest people in the world who have just
Mhm.
had crazy experiences, because you only know like your pain scale is only to like the most painful thing you've ever experienced is the most painful thing you've ever experienced. So as
Mhm.
a child falling over, that's a 10 out of 10 pain. It's like I've
Mhm.
never that feels terrible, but then they fall over more, and
Yeah.
you become a pretty hard-wearing kid once you start getting going through that, or other experiences in life too.
Mhm.
So it makes a lot of sense. And actually, this you kind of talked about it. A lot of the questions I had laid out, we've kind of touched on some of them, and,
Yeah.
and one of them you kind of touched on here was the skill acquisition within bodybuilding,
Yeah.
and whether or not you think it's an underappreciated and underrated aspect of lifting. Because again, and many people just think about reps, loads, sets, but stability, the ability to have good stability in lifts, execution, mind muscle connection, some of those finer details, the ability to actually train hard, go underappreciated.
Mhm.
So yeah, I wondered if you had thoughts on that. I kind of have sent you in that direction anyway.
Yeah, we covered a lot of that with the mind muscle connection. But one of the things I had mentioned, and we can connect this to what we were just talking about, is it's also a skill to be in the tumultuous whirlwind of physical pain and still be able to have the mind muscle connection, have that mental resilience or fortitude in order to say, just keep the focus on the muscle and keep training what you're trying to train and do that. That's a skillful. Jocko Willink popped in my head. Do you know who Jocko Willink is? Is someone?
Yes.
Yeah, he's just sort of known for having the features that you just described. Um, but yeah, that is something. And I think there's this old notion. I'll bring it back to something I probably mentioned here too, potentially, that um, it was the idea that one of the mechanisms that was put forth is that hormones that are released during large muscle group exercises, blah, blah, blah. And like if you squat big, right, then
Yeah.
that you just everything else will get stronger and grow better. Maybe it's hormones or what have you. It's a whole other topic. But I think related to what we're talking about is having done those really, really hard exercises, not avoiding the hard stuff, doing the hardest stuff. Even if maybe like, deadlifts aren't the best. Like what do deadlifts target? Like compared to like EMG.
Everything.
Yeah, they kind of get everything, but like
The soul.
yeah, your soul, right? Like the one I call them DNA changers. Like someone else called, I'm stealing that from someone else, but it's like, that's obviously facetious, but doing deadlifts and going to where, you're concerned that your shoulder joints are going to just completely dislocate. That then sets the bar for skillful training, hard training under duress, and like doing a biceps curl that hurts and your biceps are burning and blah, blah, blah. Like that is like, that's just, you can easily put that, whatever psychological strategies have to come into play to keep going and do like a Widowmaker style deadlift where you hold the bar and you keep going until eventually maybe your grip gives out. When you have that in place and you can do that, then most other exercises, the side effect of the pain, which would distract you from the execution, the mind muscle connection, those sorts of things, that becomes almost immaterial because it all becomes easier, right? So this is one of the beautiful things about weight training is that, compared to your workouts, most of the day is pretty easy,
Yeah.
in a certain way. So that's something that is, really, I think an aspect of the skill, like skillful movements. A lot of times you think of those as being something that you're doing in isolation got a low heart rate, you're doing surgery if you're a surgeon, right? Or you have a miniature at home that you're painting, or you're doing something with very fine motor skills. But it's also skillful to be able to have a controlled activation strategy and exercise execution in the face of extreme excruciation and pain and quote unquote misery, and to keep doing that. And that's something that it's interesting. It's a skill that can't be acquired without enough motivation, right? If you don't have enough screws loose in your head, or you're just not something, you don't have anger, or, not enough therapy, that you go in the gym and you just like want to bang the weights and do a battle with gravity, then you won't ever get there. You won't ever be exposed to what you need to be exposed to in order to gain that skill, because you'll never do that. You got to be a little bit silly to want to do that to yourself. And then it becomes not a big deal. And you can go and, one of the things, people would ask me sometimes, I'm sure you get this too, like, so how often you go to the gym? You're probably in the gym like twice a day, like, 7 days a week. And I'm like, no, I usually train like 4 times a week. It's like, oh, and I say, but what I do is probably not something that you would ever want to do. Like, you wouldn't want to train the way I do. But for me, that's just the normal day. And this isn't like, like I'm not doing anything special. I just go and I train hard, and I like training hard. And for me, that's what I've been doing for 40 plus years. Same as you go in and you train harder and do something that's, painful in a way that most people would never want to do to themselves unless they're a bodybuilder, or unless they're some kind of an athlete. So that skill can only be acquired if you have the motivation to go into the fire, so to speak, and withstand the heat and the discomfort in order to learn how to do that skill, acquire that skill under duress. So that's an interesting thing. Like, you can do like a perfect squat, with no weight, or with a light weight. I've seen like you see exercise execution videos and blah, blah, blah. It's like, okay, well, you got like 5-pound plates on the bar. Like, this isn't really relevant to what happens at the end of a set, when you're, close to failure, and you got to maintain an activation pattern when all the other motor units are fatigued, and you really that's the skill, right?
Yeah.
You've got different circumstances. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think that is unbelievably underappreciated. I think it was by myself as well for many years, where I just kind of discounted it. I think it's like most people in the gym, once they get to that first rep that's a bit uncomfortable, where they have to like really focus, where they have to really control things, probably when they're just approaching a 3-4 RER, or like 3 at best RER. Like, this is when you switch on and really like take control. And I think about it, an easy example is on leg extensions. People will start feeling the burn, and they'll be like, oh, I failed. It's like, no, you probably have 5 really burny, excruciating, horrible reps. And that is exactly the time you have to mentally switch on. And yet, like you said, has to be a learned skill, when you have to have the motivation for it too. And you can clearly see it in lifters in the gym. Those, like, when you look through an entire set, those that have it and those that just, they are not going there. And typically it shows in the physique as well, because you're taking your psychology to a place it doesn't want to go, and that takes your physiology to a place it probably doesn't really want to be going either.
I mean, you probably would get some people to just not want to lift weights if you told them this. But if the mindset was, okay, basically, using the idea of effective reps, like those first 8 plus reps or whatever of the set of 12 or whatever that you're going to do, like, those are just to get you to the point where the reps start to count. These are the ones that matter now. They'll be like, well, I don't want to do those reps. I don't want to do that. I remember, do you remember you've seen the video of Tom Platz squatting with 505, I think it was, for
I've seen a lot of
reps.
Tom Platz. I don't know if I've seen that specific one though, but I can imagine it. I think
he's got a green. I think the belt's green. Oh yeah, you gotta. It's a classic Tom squat. Yeah, 495 or 50. I think it was 505 with the big collars on. But he starts the set out. He's a little bit older at this time. Tom's still going strong. He's still squatting crazy weights. He's out in California. You can find those videos too. But you see, he's going up and down, full range of motion like Tom always did. And he gets to set or rep 10, 11, or 12. And you're like, when he starts the set, you're thinking, God, looks like he's going to get like 8 or 9 reps, and he's still just getting warmed up. I think, his joints are probably creaky, whatever. And then he starts getting hard, and you can see he gets this grin on his face. He's like, yeah, this is where I want to be, baby. Now we're going after it. Because like he was looking for, he's like, oh, this is the fun part, right? It's like we're standing in line at the amusement park. And we're standing in line. We're waiting, we got to pay and we got to go through the turnstiles and they're going to check to make sure we're not bringing food in. It's like, and now there's the roller coaster. Yeah, baby. Like all those reps up into the effective ones are just standing in line. Those don't do you any good. You stop then. There's actually a study out of Japan that I cite in my fortitude training book where they equated volume in, I think, 2 different groups. And they were doing sets of 10, and they just took like the set of 10 and broke it into 2 sets of 5 with like 30 seconds rest in between. And they got no muscle growth in that group. The workload was the same. So they were basically stopping like 5 reps shy of failure. They got nothing. It was like one of the earliest studies that really substantiated that idea of effective reps and that you have to push hard. Training volume was exactly the same in the 2 groups. Just the one did the reps continuously, and they did those once they got through the line, they kept going as opposed to just stopping because they wanted to be in the amusement park.
This makes as a side note, we've talked about logbooking, of course, and like everyone will know about that. And Jordan Peter's big on logbooking. I think he was one of the people that made it and like notorious for bodybuilding. But that's something that I really utilize with my training is like I see last week's performance and I'm like, I want to beat it because psychologically and physiologically, like I could quite easily, if I didn't know, think I've trained as hard as last time or hit failure. But by having those numbers and obviously taking care of technique, because you can let your technique go out the window, like I make sure that I am consistently training like very, very hard. So yeah, the logbook for me, like that is so vital. I couldn't go in there and just kind of hope that I'm doing hard training.
Yeah. I think for people like you, me, people who are not the genetic elite, who don't just lift and then the muscle cells, the muscle just hypertrophies because it's so susceptible to a hypertrophic stimulus that the logbook it's very, very underutilized. I've been a big proponent of logbooks since actually before I was doing DC training, like back in the 90s. I started figuring out logbooking was really, really important. The thing there, of course, like we said before, you want to just beat the logbook so badly that your form goes to shit. So there will be times when you sort of go a little overboard in order to get the reps. But as long as you're not hurting yourself, as long as you're not being too silly, I think that's okay. In part because that also trains that effort level. And, I'm stealing from Manfred Spitzer, as a German physician, who would often say, how kids learn how to walk from fall to fall, right? So you go into that zone where you push up against your failure point and you get those reps that like, that's a little bit sloppy. And I would always note that. Like I would sometimes put, if I got 40, I would put 12 plus 2. Those last 2 didn't count. I don't count those just so I know, how many sloppy ones I did. But you need to get into that zone where you're testing yourself to some degree so that you can get used to just then knowing, okay, I got to be more focused when I get to this point. And that's how you learn the skill is from fall to fall, by making mistakes and then learning how to correct them. So
that makes so much sense, Scott. It's funny. I did today straight at deadlifts. I've used the same weight and basically hit pretty much the same reps, I think, for the last 4 weeks. But every week I was like, I'm purposely matching one because I got a bit sick and I continued to train. And then it was a case of, I knew when I first got to that weight and those reps, visually they looked okay, but internally I could feel my lower back wasn't quite as tight. The next day I got some soreness through my erectors more than like other areas that I would like to. So I was like, I'm just going to work with this weight and get tighter on it. As a form of progression is going to be kind of that technique component that way, versus just being like, no, I have to beat it next week. Like that would be not being smart. That would be going down the wrong route. So I think this actual discussion has ended up being almost a discussion around how to keep growing when you're a bit of a hard gainer and not a genetic elite, which is great. As a final, if you've got time to talk about this very quickly,
Sure.
Scott, it's something I've really enjoyed hearing you talk about. I think it was from Dante Trudell that you got it from, where he talked about kind of getting freaky with it.
Getting funky with it.
Yeah. I think that was just a case of like not being too strict to like, again, technique, like, oh, you have to lift A to B perfectly like this diagram, but you can kind of almost feel it in your own body, like you said, maybe introduce some other muscles to allow that muscle to get closer to failure. So I'd love to hear, what does getting freaky with it kind of mean to you, though?
I think what Dante meant by that was actually something a little bit different. It's related to weak muscle groups. And maybe if Dante listened to this, he can correct me, but it was the idea that you may have to find non-conventional exercises or use non-conventional approaches because biomechanically, neurologically, you may not be set up to activate that weak muscle terribly well, right? So you need to, mind muscle connection, developing that, learning how to do that is very, very important. But you may need to, let's say you're just doing regular bicep standing barbell curls, dumbbell curls, standard stuff, and your biceps just continue to be weak. So he might come up with an exercise where you put the biceps on stretch and you get funky with it. You do something kind of funky and weird, where you literally there's no cheating that can be involved because you got yourself in a position where you can't put any body English into it. And because of the nature of the exercise, it forces you to use the muscle that you're trying to target. So like one that is a funky exercise, this is probably going to I have never pieced these two things together this way, but I'll do so now, is actually it's kind of funny. And I'm intentionally mentioning him so that he can get some credit for this. So the somersault squat has like it's
become popular.
It's become super duper popular.
Yeah.
Joe Daniels, you can find his YouTube video from like 2008, came up with that, right? Years ago. And swing this kettlebell on Instagram. That's his exercise. Dante said, this is awesome. Like Dante brought this to Intense Muscle right after he saw it. Like, this is phenomenal. He tried it out himself. So for people who don't know, he can look it up, but the somersault squat, initially Joe, he does it with kettlebells. Now you can do it sort of various ways. You can do it however Joe says, because he invented it. That's the way I see it. But you would put the bar of a Smith machine in the crease of your hips, and that basically is where the load is applied. And then you basically do you do a squatting motion, but you help keep the bar in that crease, and you also change the relative load from bottom to top by doing kind of a rolling forward movement with your legs. So when you come up, you let your upper body roll forward as if you're standing up and trying to do a somersault like that. It's a great name. It's perfect. And what that does, if you were to stay upright, then the bar is going to want to slide down your quads, because then the bars here and your quads are just going to be upright. So if you roll forward like that, it helps keep the crease a little bit, helps keep the bar, and then you're holding with your hands. But also, if this is upper body here, let's say, as you stand up, you do this, that means there's less load. Your upper body isn't being lifted upwardly. So you're changing the loading curve by letting your upper body come forward and not be lifted up over the course of the range of motion. So I do them sometimes when I stay upright. I do them sometimes when I'm rolling forward. But that's a quad isolation exercise that works phenomenally. And you can change the loading curve. You've got, what are our quad isolation exercises? Knee extensions, sissy squats, somersault squats. And then I have one, called a Smith, a sissy hack squat. Smith sissy hack squat.
I've been doing those.
Yeah. Where you hold the bar, it's like kind of like doing a barbell hack squat. So I have a YouTube video on that. But the somersault squat is very non-conventional. Now it's just kind of taken off. It's gone viral. People don't know where it came from because they forgot. Another example of like how things kind of get lost in the mix.
Yeah.
But it's a really nice example. The more I think about it, is you've got someone who can't get their quads to grow, right? They do leg presses, their quads don't get sore. They do squats, it's always glutes, low back, their quads don't get sore. They change their foot position, what have you. And you'll see with the Smith sissy hack and with the somersault squat, when you go to those for the first time, it's been some time for me, and you do them, especially on the Smith sissy hack, which you have experience with, you're like, holy shit, this feels totally different on my quads than a knee extension. You can tell how utterly different it is. And that exercise, you can't, because the bar is behind you. If you tried to bend over and kind of like deadlift the bar up, you just can't do it. The bar being behind you and being in that plane of motion forces you to do a sissy hack squat in an up and right fashion that is de facto a a barbell hack squat's a great quad exercise too. But those are exercises that people say, nah, you got to go with the just squat. Like Tom Platz didn't have to do any of that crazy stuff to get big legs, right? Okay. But Tom Platz, like, look at his biomechanics. Like he could get his butt lower than his heels if anyone else could, right? Like, it was just crazy. So you have to choose those exercises that basically make it such that you can't not activate the target muscle, at least well, and also in a way that you weren't able to previously. So like, that's a funky exercise. Like, I've been doing those somersault squats and sissy hack squats for 15, 20 years now, right? I don't see other people doing them. Now it'd be interesting to go into a gym and see if people are doing the somersault squats, but
I haven't seen them in my gyms, at least, but a previous guest, Oscar Moscat, an amazing natural bodybuilder. It seems like he's really popularized them. He's got hundreds of thousands, I think, of followers on Instagram. So
he's
been doing them. People see him with massive quads. They're like, I'm going to do that.
I tell you, I mean, this may have been genetics and coincidence. It is an N of one. But Joe's quad sweep, and you can tell if you keep your legs lined up, you can literally, at least I could, maybe I was just convincing myself of this, but I could really feel that the lateralis was being preferentially activated because of the nature of the mechanic. Those. Yeah. And in that original video, look it up, Joe Daniels, YouTube, he shows his quads afterwards. You're like, oh my God, like this quad sweep is like, it's like, that's kind of bizarre. Like, there's almost looks like there were no implants there, but it's like, it was ridiculous. He's not a huge guy, but his quads were just sick. And he competed on stage, and first you're like, look at the guy's quad sweep. That's ridiculous. And he attributed it to that, I believe, back in the day. Yeah. So that's what Get Funky with it is don't be afraid. If you've exploited and used those basic exercises, like, don't immediately go to all the weird stuff that you see on TikTok right off the bat. Try the basics out. I spent 10 years like trying to do heavy barbell back squats and got to where I was doing like 585 for sets of 8 and 10. It was ridiculous. But I was going to 90 degrees at the knees, but my glutes got huge. My quads didn't grow the way they should have. That was sort of stupid, but it's an example of like, that does not work for me. I'm going to have to go deeper, do it on a Smith machine, blah, blah, blah. Go with the big exercises, the ones that work. But eventually, if you've gotten where you've put on massive amounts of size, you're pretty advanced, and then you just can't seem to be able to eke out more size, you got a muscle that just lags. That's when getting funky with it would come into play. Exercise selection, potentially also higher reps too. That's one thing. He's had people do sets of 50 sometimes.
Oof.
Yeah. There are 100 reps.
Yeah, that takes some willpower.
Yeah, exactly. Right. But that's a novel stimulus,
Yes.
So that's what the getting funky with it is. But it's, that's not the first step generally. It's, for most folks.
Yeah,
it's not
well
necessary.
said.
Yeah.
I always think it's like programs online, textbooks, like that information is amazing for that novice intermediate lifter. But then for that advanced person, those things don't apply as much. The rules, quote unquote, don't apply as much. And that's where you learn your body a bit more. And if you don't lean into that, I don't think you're going to progress it as far as it could possibly go. Obviously, you're still within the realms of normal quality training, but getting funky with it, some unconventional things can definitely help along the way. how are you for time, Scott? Is there anything else you want to cover today? Because I know we had planned to cover, but I appreciate I've already had a good amount of your time.
We've covered, I'm looking here, I made a bunch of notes. I think we've covered pretty much everything that all the big pieces. There was one thing here.
Amazing.
Yeah, I did. I actually, we had a question about novelty, and I wrote
Yep.
something like, well, that's kind of a nice definition. I bolded it in my little notes here. And I wrote to myself, I'll just share this. This is like from Scott's diary. Novelty is the essential nature of a stimulus. Talking about stimulus for hypertrophy. Excursion from normal disturbances in homeostasis that warrant an adaptation to resist future such disturbances. So again, novelty is the essential nature of a stimulus, i.e. an excursion from normal disturbances in homeostasis that warrant an adaptation to resist future such disturbances. So what that means basically is we're walking along. When you look at what happens inside muscle cells, there's an energetic disturbance. This phosphorylation potential, ratios of ADP and inorganic phosphate and ATP, they all change. Things turn on the mitochondrial oxidative phosphorylation. There's a disturbance in homeostasis that turns on the enzymatic machinery to produce more ATP, right? That's normal. We have all sorts of normal, our body is constantly thermoregulating. We've got all sorts of hormone feedback loops that are continuously maintaining homeostasis in some way. And all the time, there's normal disturbances in that. But the stimulus that we're looking at, the one that really matters, is something that is an excursion. And this is where, we vary in terms of whether someone's genetics will basically perceive that excursion as warranting an adaptation to prevent future excursions, right? So the excursion from a normal disturbance in homeostasis of weight training for some people with really good genetics means, that's lots and lots of tension. We need to be able to resist increases in tension that could be damaging the muscle by getting a bigger muscle. We make the motor bigger so we can drive fast. If that's the stress, that's the stimulus, we need bigger fibers. Whereas some people's genetics are, but that was a set that took 30 seconds, right? And it was fatiguing, and there was some fatigue that was incurred during that. Like, we can just shift the isoforms of the myosin here to something that's more economical. And we can increase the content of the mitochondria, and we can make the fibers more endurance oriented. That also solves the problem, right? So novelty is literally the nature of what makes a stimulus that causes an adaptation an actual stimulus. If it's not novel, if it's not new, if it's not outside of the norm in some way, then it doesn't produce an adaptation. You just kind of stay where you are, based on the normal level of disturbances. The other side of the coin is, like, for instance, disuse atrophy. You cast a muscle, and it's funny, it doesn't take much to maintain muscle mass sort of in its, regular parameters, but you completely cast a muscle and it will atrophy pretty rapidly. But there's actually, like, one study I know was done in rats. Like, it doesn't take much. You can take a muscle out of a cast, like, just give it a few minutes, 30 minutes of just even passive movement, according to this one study with mice I'm thinking of. And it prevented, for instance, the shortening of sarcomeres that normally happen when a muscle is atrophied at a shortened position. So it just needs, like, some level of normalcy. It's like, okay, I'm going to have to stay at this normal resting length, for instance.
Yeah.
Right. But in order to get outside of those normal parameters in terms of size, enzymatic content, et cetera, you need to have a novel stimulus, something that's novel, new, and different, where your genetics say, okay, yeah, we should probably adapt to that. That's important. And if you got lucky, you're a bodybuilder, then you get more muscle size. If not, then you get better in the gym, but you don't necessarily grow a whole lot. It doesn't show up in your physique.
I guess my only question to that, with it being kind of novel, new, this is one of those kind of misnomers maybe of progressive overload, where people are like, I have to have hit, if I could do 100 by 10 and that's my best performance, is I've only, I have to grow, I have to do 100 by 11.
Mm-hmm.
But it's more a case of the reason you can do 100 by 11 is because you grew to be able to do that, if that makes sense. So like you could repeat performance for multiple weeks and still be kind of quote unquote novel, as in it's a growth response. It's just you haven't seen that adaptation take place just yet because maybe you're quite advanced. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I know what you're getting at. So the logbook isn't telling you everything that's going on, right? There's really grossly, we've got muscular adaptations and neural adaptations, right? So we talked about like cheating on your form, and you can progress the logbook just because you've done your reps faster and you've gotten sloppier with them. And you can even keep your form really tight. It could be the same. And it could be that you've just picked up a novel exercise. Let's say you start doing the somersault squats, right? And you could be getting the largest part of what you see in terms of the logbook progression could be neurological. And there are some researchers, Jeremy Lenicky, for instance, he's done a lot of blood flow restriction stuff. His lab and some of the people who've come through his lab are really big on the idea that, muscle hypertrophy is not really a major form of adaptation in skeletal muscle. At least when we're thinking in the context of a resistance exercise, because if you look at what really is going on in terms of increasing performance over the course of weeks, months, and years, much of it's neurological, right? I mean, if you're a natural guy and you put on, let's say, 20 kilos of muscle mass, 40 pounds of muscle mass, like that's from first day in the gym to when you're, 10 years later, right? You may have, so that maybe is a 40, 50, 60% increase in muscle size. I think there's like 35 kilos of muscle in the reference man. Your standard body composition is like 154 pound, 70 kilo reference man. Something, maybe it's 32, something like that. But so you haven't got 100% increase in if you're a natural person, natural competitor, in muscle mass, but you may have tripled your strength. Your strength is certainly more than 100% greater in many, many cases. So proportionally speaking, there are neurological adaptations that contribute. And it's a much more economical, less energy expensive way to go about adapting to that stimulus, right? So back to the logbook then. Yeah, you could, you could be progressing, and it could be reflective of basically very little going on in terms of muscle mass. Or you could be, for instance, keeping like you were doing with stiff-legged deadlifts. There actually are some subtle, you're doing things in that you're being more and more restrictive with your execution and getting the same number of reps, so that there actually is a better performance in that you're doing the same number of reps with the same weight, but your form is better and you're relying more on work being done by the target muscle versus the other muscles that you would otherwise call in. So there's a performance enhancement that doesn't show up in the logbook. And then ideally, if assuming your recovery is what it needs to be, then you're making growth in that target muscle over time.
Yeah.
So, in the big picture, sometimes people get lost in the weeds, and I bring this in to kind of help people. And I say, tell you, if you just over the course of time with the basic bodybuilding exercises that work for your muscle mass, make yourself, I know I've said this on this podcast, make yourself into one of the most impressive lifters out there, then it's going to show up in your physique in almost every case. There will be people who are just like, oh, I can't believe how strong that person is given their physique. But for the most part, that will be the case. So whether you go for some weeks where you do what you did, which is really smart, and say, you know what, I need to tighten up my form. If I keep my reps the same each week when my form is getting better and better and more focused on my hamstrings in your case, that's a win. I'll do that. And then maybe the next time you come in, if you're not sick, you might go back to something that's maybe a little looser in form and get 4 more reps, right? Because now you know how to activate your hamstrings better because you practice that, right? And then you also let your form go a little bit looser, and the hamstrings have also grown, and all those things kind of collude, and all of a sudden, like, you make a performance leap. I would see that sometimes back in the day when I was competing in my off seasons. All of a sudden, I'd be moving along, and all of a sudden, like, I'd just have this, like, the growth would come, and the strength sometimes would come in rather rapid increments. And this wasn't like PED related or anything like that. It was just like, that's just how it seemed like it would happen. All of a sudden there'd be
Yeah.
some growth, as if there was an overshooting phenomenon. I wasn't always, sometimes I could pin it down to, I took an extra day off for training and I rested well and I'm sleeping great, what have you. But sometimes you don't always see in the logbook this perfectly linear, increase in things. Sometimes it will kind of, zigzag around in a way that, that doesn't always tell you what's going on in terms of the muscle size, because you've got other
Yeah.
components that contribute to the logbook performance.
That makes so much sense. Yeah, I think my main concern is when people think about progressive overload, they're like, oh, if I didn't add a rep, if I didn't add a smaller amount of load, like I've wasted my session or I'm not growing. It's like, just be comfortable with it's like progression is going to slow down when it's not a new movement or you aren't new to the thing itself, because adaptations, and especially as a natural, once you've been doing it a long time, muscle growth is like watching paint dry. So it's a very slow process. Scott, this has been a fantastic chat. Thank you so much for your time as always. Always appreciate it. Always great insights, and people always enjoy these. If people want to keep up to date with the things that you've got going on, or if you've got anything new going on, let them know. Obviously, you mentioned your training book. That's a great training program for people to think about as well.
Oh yeah, Fortitude training's been out for forever. So it still works. I got to revise. I'm slow. There's some literature review things that need to be updated. I think just semantics really, but the program, I'm really happy. It's sort of the test
held the test of time.
Yeah. Yeah. We mentioned Chris, actually. I think he just posted some stuff the other day. Like he had some layoffs and a broken foot and some things like that. But Chris has been doing Fortitude training. We talked about it on my podcast, and he's loving it. He's having so much fun with it. And he had some I can't speak to the numbers, and it still wasn't perfect data. It was N of 1, but he was able to get himself back pretty rapidly using Fortitude training to a better body composition than he'd had previously. So it was like, if I wanted, like we talked about, if I were a more savvy social media person, I would take that and try to look how awesome Fortitude training was. I won't say that, but I'll say he's had a lot of fun training that way. And it allowed him to work around his broken foot for this prep that he's currently in. He's competing in a few days here. Well, by now he will be done with that by the time this makes its way out. But people just like the training program. It's just fun because you get to kind of steer your own ship, and you do train hard. You train as hard as you will allow yourself to, based on the way I set things up. So anyway, I guess I'm just happy as a kind of like a dad. It's like my son has made his way out in the world, and he's been successful, and he's still holding his own, because the program seems to hold up well with, even as new things come out in the science, the program still seems to hold water. So that makes me happy.
For sure. Yeah, I'll make sure I link in your Instagram in the description, and take people to your website so they can pick up Fortitude and enjoy some great gains with that program. Thanks, which they will if they execute it well. And thank you guys for listening as always.
Yes, appreciate it very much. Thanks, Steve. Always.
Cheers.